This is They Create Worlds, episode 244, The History of Commodore, part 1.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality, you'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
We join you live from a chat that's in the past, in the future, in the present. I don't even know which one anymore. All I know is I've had 3.5 hours of sleep, 8 cups of coffee, and then this Commodore's been loading things for the last 12 hours. No one knows what's going on anymore, not even Alex, possibly not even chat. Maybe my cats do. They're the producers. Hi, how are you doing today? I'm the one in the hat.
Hello, one in the hat. That's right, here we are, as we do every year, about ready to embark on our live-streamed recording of a 3-part, yes chat, 3-part episode, this time specifically on the company Commodore International and its predecessor, Commodore Business Machines Limited of Canada. A major company in defining the world of home computers, which means that they are also a major company in defining a certain period of the history of video games. There's a lot of information out there on them. We could probably do an 8-part episode if we really wanted to. I don't want to do that. My head is already exploding trying to get in all the information to do a 3-part episode, but definitely a lot to cover because it's a fascinating company with some real crazy characters in it.
We have talked about Commodore in the past, tangentially, a little bit about various things, a little bit about the C64, especially the Amiga and the Commodore PET. Its influences where it saw a lot of popularity in Europe.
Great, then I guess we're done here.
Okay, well, that's it for the live stream. We'll see you later. Where's Bacterial Love again?
That's right. Obviously, Commodore has come up quite a bit and was featured in another one of these 3-part episodes back in the day when we did the home computer price wars. But we have not looked at the company from its very beginning to its very end. This seemed like a good opportunity to do that. And even if it's not, well, that's what we're doing anyway. Just as a reminder, before we get into the heart of the episode, for those of you that are listening to this as a normal episode, we are doing this as a live stream event, which means that we are interacting with our fans on the chat. There'll be more tangents than usual and probably some references to stuff going on in the comments. Editing Jeffrey will be editing a lot of that out, crying manly tears the entire time because of the added difficulty. We'll definitely still be leaving some of that stuff in as well, so it won't quite play the same way as a normal episode.
Commodore. It came from Canada. It invaded the United States, and then it decided to do forays into Europe. How do we start this thing? Do we look at Jack and say, "Hi, Jack, how you doing?"
Yeah, that's exactly what we're going to do, sort of, because he's dead, so we can't really ask him that.
That's what seances and Ouija boards are for, okay? We're close to Halloween here. We have to do something fun, like talk to Jack.
Yes, of course. I can just see the Ouija board now. It'll be like, is Jack here? Yes. What now? Cut the price. That's exactly how it would go.
But it's already free. How can it be cheaper?
Yes, the ghost of Jack Tramiel would likely charge us for the seance. That makes sense. Talk about a man with a resonant voice, too. I mean, we were making fun of my resonant voice earlier, but that man has a deep, deep voice. I can't imagine what it would have been like getting a Jack attack back in the day. Fun fact, other people in the video game industry with deep voices, whom I have personally interviewed, Don Daglow and the dearly departed Gene Lipkin, former VP at Atari and president of CoinOp at Atari. So yeah, we really do need to start by discussing Jack Tramiel, because there is no company without him, even though the company did survive for another decade after he left. It never really escaped the shadow of Jack Tramiel, and Jack Tramiel's philosophy, Jack Tramiel's outlook, Jack Tramiel's way of doing business is really what set the tone for the company throughout its entire history. You can't really understand any of those aspects of Jack Tramiel without having a pretty thorough understanding of where he came from, because where he came from is rather dark.
Really? Is he a native of Canada or a native of the United States?
Neither one.
Oh.
Jack Tramiel was born at some point. Records are a little confused for reasons that will become quite obvious. During the famous Atlantic Acceptance High Commission, the Hughes Commission in Canada, he gave evidence that he was born on December the 13th, 1927. Other sources indicate that he may have been born September the 13th, 1927, or even December the 13th, 1928, a full year later. Also, don't know exactly what his name was at the time, though the most common referred one would be Edek Tramielski. He was born in the Polish city of Lodz, which I'm sure I horribly mispronounced, but that's okay. Young Tramielski's life was obviously changed very suddenly and very thoroughly in the year of 1939 when Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany invaded and conquered Poland. Conquered half of Poland, gave the other half to Stalin, but we're not getting into World War II history. That's way too much tangent. But we do have to talk some World War II history as it relates to young Edek. Jack Tramiel, and I'm going to start referring to him by that name at this point, even though he doesn't assume that name until he moves to the United States. Jack Tramiel and his family were Jewish. Lodz was a city with a large Jewish population, as many Polish cities were. About 1/3 of the 600,000 people that called Lodz home in 1939 were Jewish. When the Germans first came through, Jack Tramiel has memories of being very impressed by them because they were in these fancy uniforms and they were marching in unison through the streets and all looked very fancy. What little kid doesn't like a parade? In fact, he, in later years, one of his employees at Commodore and then later at Atari Corporation was another European Jew by the name of Sig Hartmann. When they got drunk, they would sometimes sing German marching songs together, or at least they did that on one occasion where they were observed. But, of course, that admiration didn't last for long, as the entire Jewish population was forced into the Lodz ghetto. They were in a ghetto from, I think it might have been 1940. Obviously, the invasion was 1939. They were moved into a ghetto pretty quickly. The entire family lived in one room. Jack was an only child, so that would be him and his parents. They tried to work to make ends meet. His father worked in shoemaking. I don't know if that was his trade before or if that was forced upon him by the circumstances, while Jack himself worked in a pants factory. This situation lasted until 1944, when they were finally removed from the ghetto and herded into railroad cars and shipped to the concentration camp Auschwitz. Jack and his family were not at Auschwitz for very long. The ghetto was liquidated in 1944. Prior to that, they had been moving Jews in and out as well, but when they were moved, it was liquidated. They were told that they would be going to Germany. The railroad cars instead deposited them at the notorious Auschwitz, where everyone was evaluated for their fitness to work or their needs to be dealt with through other means. At this point, Jack was separated from his mother, as they separated them in that way. But both Jack and his father were put into the group that would be allowed to live. They stayed in Auschwitz for a few weeks, during which time Jack was examined by Dr. Josef Mengele, the infamous angel of death, or Dr. Death, I should say, of the German concentration camp system. At that point, he and his father were both determined to be fit enough to work. Therefore, they were transported once again, this time to just outside of Hanover, where they were placed to work building new satellite facilities for the Neuengamme concentration camp. Neuengamme is not in Hanover, but the facilities that were being built around Hanover were technically satellite facilities there. At this point, I just want to mention, because Ethan Johnson, friend of the show, and several of others of us did a live reading and errata fest for Stephen Kent's Ultimate History of Video Games. For some reason, one of the errors in that book is that he indicated that Jack Tramiel volunteered to work because he figured that if he was working, they would at least have to feed him. Nobody volunteered for work in the concentration camps. You were either told you are working or they decided there was no use for you. And then you were not only not working, you were also not breathing. So he didn't volunteer. It was forced labor. I'm sure Jack, as industrious as he is, if he were given an opportunity to volunteer to live, he would. But that's not how it worked in old Nazi Germany. At first, his father and he were working together. Just to give the timeline a little more granularity, August 1944, the ghetto was liquidated. They were at Auschwitz a few weeks. They were starting work Neuengamme in the late summer, early fall. By December 1944, they had been separated and working on different work crews. Jack Tramiel didn't talk about his Holocaust experiences all that often. He did give at least one interview to Forbes where multiple successful entrepreneurs who were Holocaust survivors gave interviews, which is where a lot of this comes from. At that time, Jack did tell the story that in one of their few meetings that they got to have after they were separated, his father kind of chastised him because other young people were finding ways to steal food to bring to their elders. He was a little annoyed that Jack wasn't doing that for him. He therefore went ahead and started observing the kitchen, which was behind an electric fence, until he found a way that he could get underneath the fence by burrowing and steal a little bit of food. He said he got one potato and some peels. Then when he got to his father, malnutrition was so bad that he could not actually eat it. It was not long after this experience that the elder Tramiel, or Tramielski, whatever their last names were at the time, which is not being flippant, Jack himself has been inconsistent on that point, died. Jack says that he later learned that his father was killed by an injection of gasoline. I don't know about that, and it is not my place to fact-check Jack Tramiel's Holocaust experience, which is his. But that's what he was told. Whether that's a real thing, they were experimenting with that, whether there was something lost in translation, he wasn't there at the moment, I don't know, but that is what he legitimately believed was what killed his father. According to Jack, and I mean, this is directly from, an interview that he did, not direct quotes, but things that he said, by the time he got to spring of 1945, he was basically in despair. But, of course, at that time, the war was finally coming to an end. He was in the Hanover area, so he was in an area that was being overrun by Western Allied forces, not the Soviets. Finally, in April 1945, the camp was liberated by the American Army. Jack Tramiel was 16 at the time. All of this happened by the time of his 16th birthday. There's not a lot of detail as to what happened over the next couple of years, which I may remind you is a time when he was still a teenager. He gives a couple of hints in this Forbes interview. He remembers that the next 2 years were largely preoccupied with figuring out how to get food, just how to survive. He recounts that one time he tricked his way into a sanitarium for rich people and was able to eat some particularly scrumptious food during that period of time. He mentions that he spent some time working in an American Army kitchen, another way to get himself some food, and that in general, he was doing odd jobs. One bit of good news after the war is he did discover that his mother survived. Obviously, his father did not, but his mother survived. His mother was back in Lodz, but in the meantime, he had met a fellow concentration camp survivor, Helen Goldgrub, and decided that not only would he marry her, but that they would go to the West. He was dead set on going to America. Jack Tramiel and Helen Goldgrub married in Germany in July 1947. Then they immigrated separately to the United States shortly thereafter with the help of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. So yeah, that's Jack Tramiel's beginnings, and we'll get in a second to what he did after he came to the United States. But I just want to stop there because obviously this kind of traumatic experience is going to impact anyone that goes through it. And it definitely had some specific impacts on Jack, some of which people speculate and observe, some of which he himself admits. First of all, it instilled in him a basic instinct and need for survival. I don't just mean survival in this sense as living. I mean being able to maintain a lifestyle, being able to live a life. He became very focused on family. Family for Jack didn't just mean biological family, though it surely did mean that. He loved his wife. He cared deeply for and was very loyal to his 3 sons, Sam, Leonard, and Gary. Family could also mean those people who he felt were particularly loyal and trustworthy and looked out for him in business. This could be anything from a business partner and a corporate VP all the way down to a lowly engineer at any of his companies. Just anyone who he felt he could trust implicitly and was loyal to him, he would be loyal to them back. Sometimes, as family might do, family may disappoint him, and he felt he may have to chastise them or punish them. But they were always part of the family, and there was always a special level of loyalty there. The other thing that this instilled in him was a complete distrust for laws and contracts. As recounted in one of Brian Bagnall's books, couldn't tell you which one, there's 3 of them. They're all great, talking about the long, winding, torturous history of Commodore, major sources, of course, for our discussion today. In one of those books, one of the interview subjects was quoted as saying that Jack explained to him once that laws didn't save him and his family in Poland. Laws didn't save him and his family in Germany. Contracts didn't mean anything. The Germans could change their mind about anything anytime they wanted. So he didn't really have faith in that kind of thing. He believed that you needed to know a person and you needed to be able to look in their eye and give them a handshake, and that was far more important than a written deal. If he decided that you weren't someone that he needed in his circle of trustworthy associates, then he would alter the deal and tell you that pray he didn't alter it further. He was a ruthless businessman. Some of his practices were not the greatest practices. He was never crooked, most likely. We'll talk about Atlantic, where there's a little bit of question, but he was never crooked. He was never disloyal to those people who were truly important to him. But everyone else was either an asset or an obstacle to be used or overcome as needed for his and his family's survival. The collateral damage was sometimes perhaps regrettable, but always unavoidable.
One thing with tragic events like this, or people who just have bad upbringings, it can inform their behavior, but it doesn't always excuse the behavior.
Absolutely. So he would squeeze suppliers. He would refuse to honor deals. He would change the terms of deals. It was always dangerous to enter a contract with Jack Tramiel. Sometimes it went well for you, sometimes it didn't. He would change on a dime depending on what he felt he needed to in the moment. He was a very moment-to-moment, living for survival kind of guy. That isn't to say that he never planned out a little more long-term, but if you look at the history of Commodore, and if you look at the history of Atari Corporation, which we're not covering, but is still germane to Jack Tramiel's life, it's always very much reaction. Do this now and have it ready by this time in the very near future. Some of that, I'm sure, is due to his belief that that kind of motivation was what kept his company lean and hungry and always driving forward. But I think some of that had to, not to armchair psychologize too much, I'm sure some of that had to do with the fact that he grew up in an environment where he couldn't think ahead of the next month, the next week, the next sunrise. A lot of what he did was tempered by that Holocaust experience. That's just a little bit about the background of Jack Tramiel before reaching the United States.
You're definitely not joking about it being dark. I mean, that's pretty darn dark.
Yes, that's pretty darn dark. Turning our attention then back to the chronological history of Jack Tramiel, he immigrates in 1947 to the United States. He and his wife both, though they do have to come over separately for logistical reasons. They get themselves a small, I think, one-room apartment in New York City, and he gets a job as a handyman at a lamp store on Fifth Avenue. Of course, being a Polish Jew who spent a good deal of time in Germany, he doesn't really know English very well, but during this period of time, he begins to learn English by going and watching American movies. Apparently, he is also a fan of the chocolate because it is noted here in this profile that when he and his wife would go and watch American movies, they would then afterwards go pig out, words right from the Forbes article, on chocolate instead of eating dinner. After doing that for a while, he ended up in 1948 joining the U.S. Army. Don't know the exact circumstances of that, but obviously he'd had contact with the U.S. Army in Europe before. I don't know if he held them in some kind of esteem as liberators or not, but that is a thing he did. He did 2 tours of duty in the U.S. Army. The first was from 1948 to 1950 as a cook, but then the second time, in a stint less than a year from 1951 to 1952, he was actually a typewriter repairman. Don't know exactly how he got into this field, but he was doing kind of odd repair jobs even before he entered the Army. In between his 2 stints in the Army and after he left the Army for good, he also worked for a company called the Ace Typewriter Repair Company as a typewriter repairman as well. To make additional money, he also, between 1952 and 1954, was a New York taxi cab driver. I don't know. Maybe Taxi's his favorite television show. Maybe he related to that. So it is possible that if you took a cab between 1952 and 1954 in New York City, you could have been driven by one Jack Tramiel, who, by the way, I should have mentioned, did change his name officially to Jack Tramiel when he immigrated to the United States.
Did he give any history as to why he did that? Or was it just more to make a break with his past?
I imagine it was to fit in, kind of thing. Break with his past maybe as well, but just to feel more American. And of course, that name is pronounced Jack Tramiel. Tramiel, not Tramiel, as people would continually attempt to say it, which is why much later on he had a company called Tramiel Technologies Limited that was spelled Tramel. Couple things of importance happened while he was at the Ace Typewriter Company. First of all, obviously, he came to know the typewriter business, so I guess 3 things. The second thing is that he met a fellow employee and befriended a fellow employee by the name of Manfred Kopp, who was also working at the company, presumably also as a repairman. Don't have a lot of background on him. We do know that he was about the same age as Jack Tramiel. He was also Jewish, I believe, but he was born in Germany in the city of Lüneburg and was taken to France in 1933. What little we know comes from the Atlantic Acceptance Commission. Brian Bagnall probably knows more because he actually interviewed Cap. Cap's dead now. One of these days, we might get his 4th book. I know I can't really get too salty about someone not delivering their 4th book while everyone's still waiting for my 2nd book, so I will try to refrain from that. But he actually is working on a book, Commodore: The Early Years, that takes place before the trilogy of books he wrote about Commodore from its computer days. And he did talk to cops, so he probably has some more information. All that I have is the little bit that's in the Hughes Commission, the Hughes Royal Commission that investigated the Atlantic acceptance scandal. We know from there he moved to France was taken to France in 1933. 33 obviously corresponds to the rise of Adolf Hitler to become chancellor in Nazi Germany. I don't know if they were fleeing that or not. I don't know if he ended up in a camp because the French were quite the collaborators with the Nazis in shipping off their population. But the report doesn't say anything about that, so I don't know if he's a survivor or not. But he came to the United States in 1947, just as Tramiel did. He worked at the Ace Typewriter Company from then until 1950, spent 2 years in the Army himself, and according to Cap, met Tramiel when he was on leave from the Army in New York in 1951, presumably while he was visiting his old buddies at the Ace Typewriter Company. The other important thing that happened is that he used his nose for business and got nothing in return for it. According to Tramiel, the Ace Typewriter Repair Company was not doing very well. Tramiel used his Army connections to get the company a servicing contract with the Army that made things a lot better. In Tramiel's own words, most of the Forbes article doesn't have direct quotes, but in Tramiel's own words, he says, "The guy flipped, but did not give his enterprising employee a raise." Or actually, that part's not a quote. Just the guy flipped part is. He didn't call himself an enterprising employee. He did not get a raise. He was working for $50 a week, and despite getting that contract, he got no raise. So as Tramiel put it, and this is a direct quote again, "I have no intention of working for people who have no brains." So he quit. At that point, he was able to purchase a used typewriter repair shop and used typewriter refurbishment shop in the Bronx, joined together with Cap to rebrand it as I don't know if they rebranded it or if they just kept the name, but joined together with Cap to refinance this Singer Typewriter Company, which sold new and used typewriters. Pretty soon after that, they started expanding into other forms of office equipment. So the typewriter shop started out, I think, by mostly doing repair work. He mentioned specifically doing work for Fordham University. Then he started to buy used typewriters, refurbish them, and resell them. He expanded from there into other forms of office equipment and ended up discovering an adding machine from a company called Everest. It was an Italian adding machine. He wanted exclusivity. He was not able to get exclusivity. He discovered, though, that they were also popular in Canada, and he could get import exclusivity on these Everest machines by moving to Canada. So that's what he did. That is the actual origin of the company called Commodore, which was founded in 1955 in Toronto, initially as Everest Office Machines. They started out by being the exclusive importer of adding machines from the Everest Company and selling them throughout Canada. Interesting. Thanks for that additional insight, S.M. Oliva, that he may have in fact been visiting in-laws in Toronto when he decided to get those dealership rights. So in 1958, he added a line of portable typewriters from Czechoslovakia. On October 10th, incorporated a new company, which was at that time called the Commodore Portable Typewriter Company and would soon be known as Commodore Business Machines. We don't know exactly where the name Commodore came from. There are a couple of stories out there, some of them most certainly apocryphal. The one that seems most likely, though it could certainly be apocryphal as well, is that he wanted a military name. He'd been in the military. He may have even had some respect for the military for liberating the camps. I don't know that that's true, but it would stand to reason. So he wanted a military name. Admiral and General were already taken. So he went down to the next rung in the Navy ranks and called his and Cap's company Commodore. The business did okay, but it was a kind of tricky business because you're talking about importing stuff and balancing supply and demand with some, I'm sure, kind of difficult customs and excise laws to navigate as well. Even though the company was doing okay, there was a constant cash flow crisis at the company in these days, just because importing, exporting is a hard business. They were constantly in need of money. In order to raise the money they need, they relied primarily on a practice called factoring, which I know we talked about way back in the day, like practically a decade ago, in our Acclaim episodes, because they did the same thing. We may have talked about it in other places as well, but factoring, the way I saw it described once, which I think is great, is like payday loans for businesses, which is a pretty cute way to talk about it. Basically, you have product. You are going to sell that product. That is an account payable that you set up with a company, and then they pay you for it. That's a receivable. And then you have money. So the way factoring works is you go to this third-party company, a factoring company that's going to finance you, and you'll go to them and you'll say, I am going to sell these receivables for $10 a pop. They'll be like, great. What we're going to do is take your receivables, not buy them, but take your receivables and give you a loan. Basically, you're giving them a discount. They buy your receivables, they give you a loan, and then you have to pay back the loan. So they buy them at 10, give you a loan at 8, and then you have to pay them back. So you don't make as much money, but you have cash up front. It's a payday loan. So they were doing that. And then in 1959, they were looking for better terms. So they turned their attention to an up-and-coming financing company in Canada by the name of Atlantic Acceptance Corporation. We won't spend too much time on the background of Atlantic Acceptance because, like, doing an Atlantic Acceptance episode, that would be 10 episodes in itself, and I would need a forensic accountant to co-host it with me. Because I don't claim to understand half of what went on there.
So that takes corporate shenanigans to a whole new level.
Oh, God. You can't do a Commodore episode without a million shenanigans. Atlantic Acceptance Corporation was established in 1953 by a set of partners, mostly from Toronto, some from elsewhere, that included a gentleman by the name of C. Powell Morgan, who served from the founding of the company as the president. The company was founded specifically as a commercial financing business by purchasing installment obligations created through the sale on a time payment basis of motor vehicles, household appliances, and other equipment. That's a direct quote from an article talking about its founding. I think it was probably very similar, at least at its start, to what we would consider today a buy now, pay later company. Except I doubt they were 0% interest up front. But the idea that these things are being bought in installments, and so you are helping people finance this buying. So they're a financing company, but they went to non-traditional sources to get their financing. Their first major investment in the company occurred in 1958 through a company called Great Northern Capital, which took a 40% interest in the firm. That gave them the financial resources to go out and seek partners that would invest in them so that then they could invest in other people. In December of 1958, they got into bed with the U.S. Steel Pension Fund and got a $3 million loan, which allowed them to start really enhancing their financing business. Whenever you're getting involved in pension funds, it's already time to be very, very afraid. Not in the modern era, 401ks, but 1950s era pension funds. I mean, at least this is the U.S. Steel Pension Fund, not the Steelworkers Union Fund, because you really don't want to get involved with those union pension funds because they're all controlled by the mob, or so I'm told, just like pinball. Pinball and pensions, the P&P of mob control. I am so going to end up at the bottom of the East River by the time this live stream is over.
That would involve actually being near the East River. Where you are, wouldn't it be a different river?
Hey, I've been in labor unions before. Fun fact. As a librarian. What can I say? It's Illinois. You know what I'm talking about, Ethan. You know Illinois. 2 years later, in 1960, they got an even larger investment, $5 million, from the Ford Foundation. These were big, respected organizations, U.S. Steel and the Ford Foundation, that chose to invest largely through the recommendation of this Great Northern Capital, Lambert and Company. They had this aura. They were growing rapidly, and they had an aura of respectability because everyone figured if U.S. Steel and the Ford Foundation are financing them, then they must really know what they're doing. So during this period of time, they started to expand into all sorts of financing arrangements, and they decided they wanted to get involved in factoring. I don't know exactly how C. Powell Morgan and Tramiel met, except I actually do. So at the same time that they were looking to do factoring, Jack Tramiel is looking to get better terms for Commodore than he's been able to get in the past, and applied to a company called Annette and Company for financial assistance. It was through Annette and at the Annette office that he met Mr. C. Powell Morgan. They created a company called Commodore Sales Acceptance Limited. Atlantic did, called Commodore Sales Acceptance Limited, that was going to get involved in the factoring business, starting with doing factoring work for Commodore. What happened next? I can't even begin with my thorough love of corporate shenanigans to properly explain.
If you can't explain it, there's no hope for us.
What I do know is that it turns out that C. Powell Morgan was doing a lot of enriching of himself on the side. He was working with some really shady people at some other companies that we won't get into because this is not an Atlantic Acceptance episode. It's a Commodore episode. It still is, vaguely, at this point. He was passing loans around between companies in such a way that it looked like companies were paying off their loans to Atlantic Acceptance, but they were actually paying off those loans by taking out loans from other front companies that were set up by Powell and various partners. So the loans were still out there, and there was still liability, but they were pocketing the difference in interest. He was also investing some money on the side that he was hiding. Those investments were not providing a return, and so in the books it looked like Atlantic Acceptance was continuing to grow and was continuing to be very successful. But as a matter of fact, everything was being drained in the background. On June 14th, 1965, Atlantic Acceptance issued a very routine $5 million check to redeem some of its borrowings, and the check bounced.
Hello, financial fraud. How are you feeling today?
The company entered receivership 3 days later and completely and utterly collapsed.
No, you're not supposed to collapse.
This was at the time, the largest financial scandal in Canadian history. I don't know that it still is. Dale may know. Dale may have contributed to some larger ones. I don't know. But at the time, it was the largest financial collapse and scandal in Canadian history. A royal commission was established to investigate. They released a 1,000-plus page report from their investigation, which I'll admit I have not read the entire thing. It was obviously not great for C. Powell Morgan, who actually died of leukemia in 1966, which is the only thing that saved him from jail time. But it was also not a great thing for Commodore, because Commodore was kind of hip deep in all of this. When C. Powell Morgan established Commodore Acceptance Company, he also became the chairman of Commodore International and became their main financier for all of their activities. Tramiel and Cap were involved in some of these loan transfers. They were officers of some of these shell companies where money was being passed around between various companies. One excerpt from the report, just to kind of give an idea. I'm going to say a lot of words, and some people will know better than I do what all of these words mean. There was also some stock manipulation going on. Commodore went public in, I want to say, 1962 as part of its whole getting its finances in better order. It says, prior to the public issue, Morgan, Tramiel, and Cap had amassed 3/5 of all the shares of Commodore Business Machines, and Morgan used two trio companies, other companies out there, Dallas Holdings and Valley Farm and Enterprises, to corner 87% of the 300,000 shares available for public distribution at a price of $2.30 per share. Aurora Leasing lent the three men and the two companies upwards of $700,000 to do so, and obtained the money by borrowing it from Commodore Sales Acceptance. So Commodore Sales Acceptance is the factoring company that is an Atlantic Acceptance subsidiary that invested in Commodore. That company is lending money to Aurora to buy stock as a front for Morgan. And then it was underwritten. And then the proceeds of the underwriting went to Commodore Sales Acceptance to pay off Commodore Business Machine loans from that company and to reduce its borrowing from the Atlantic Group, which had reached a figure of some $1.4 million. No actual reduction in the indebtedness to Atlantic occurred, since the loans by Commodore Sales Acceptance to Aurora Leasing, with which the trio and Morgan, Tramiel, and Cap kept under the name Don Mills had financed purchases of stock, had correspondingly increased. This device of creating the illusion of repayment by merely transferring the debt to other hands was to become a trademark of Morgan's lending operations. I'm not a forensic accountant. I don't know exactly what all of that means, but what it means at the end of the day is they were passing loans around between multiple companies that they controlled at varying interest rates. They were pocketing some profit in the variation between the interest rates, since all of the companies were owned by the same people and had some of the same financial obligations. Even though it made it look like Atlantic Acceptance had fewer outstanding debts on its books, the amount of debt had actually not changed because it was just passed on to another company that was actually technically connected as well to Atlantic Acceptance. Are there any forensic accountants in the house? Am I getting warm at all here? This is what's great about doing this with chat.
We sometimes get info and corrections live.
Yeah, and SM Oliva points out, and I'm good for a good shout out, I mean, we'll keep this in the episode itself too, that he did also cover some of this in his Computer Chronicles Revisited blog, which is an excellent blog. I would also check out what SM Oliva has to say as well. There was circular borrowing going on with profits being made on the interest, and everybody ending up being in debt to everybody else, even though in the books it looks like there was a reduction in debt. I'm sure he was doing that with other people besides Commodore as well. That's why Atlantic Acceptance suddenly collapsed, because everyone thought that they had money just looking on their books, and they really didn't because it was spoken for elsewhere. Plus, I think C. Powell Morgan was also making some investments on the side for his own benefit using Atlantic Acceptance money, and some of those didn't pan out. So that was also draining. Jack Tramiel and Manfred Kopp pled ignorance to this. They were also involved in a financing deal for a supposed photocopying company that was run by, I think, an Arab out of Iraq, out of Baghdad, who claimed he had this new photocopier and but would never demonstrate it. And there was one time where they got everyone together and they were going to demonstrate it. Then the power went out, and when the lights came back on, it was gone. These are real reports from real newspapers, real reputable Canadian newspapers. Commodore had also invested in that company at the behest of Atlantic Acceptance, which was another fraudulent company that C. Powell Morgan was working with. It's nuts. We could do a whole episode on this, or somebody could, because I honestly don't think I have the accounting skills to be able to do that episode justice. But there was all sorts of craziness going on. Tramiel and Cap pleaded ignorance, and they got away with that. Commodore itself, even though they were a pass-through company for some of these loans, didn't have huge amounts of debt themselves that were accrued because of this. They kind of made it through financially, and they never got charged criminally. The Hughes Commission reported that they could find no evidence of wrongdoing. However, they said, even though we couldn't find the evidence, we think that they are just completely complicit. I don't know. And I literally don't know. They were found innocent by the Royal Commission. That's good. Were they actually complicit and really good at covering it, or were they just naive? He might have been naive at this point. Because I will say one thing, because this is the point where I want to talk about another trait of Jack Tramiel, which is that during his later days at Commodore, he watched everything financially like a hawk. Anything $1,000 or over that anyone wanted to spend, Jack Tramiel had to personally approve. He kept a very flat management structure with very little middle management because he wanted to be in on everything that was going on. I have to wonder if some of that wasn't because he was never going to let anybody surprise him again with money movements. By the 1970s, Jack was very adept at finance and moving money around. Many of the people in the Commodore books talk about that. But he may not have been that sophisticated with all of that in the 1950s and 1960s. He was a self-made man. No college education, no background in finance, a typewriter repairman who was able to parlay those skills into saving up enough money to buy a business and then aggressively expand it through hustle and getting import contracts and factoring and getting financing. Maybe he didn't know what he was doing at the time. Maybe he got took. Certainly a lot of people got took by C. Powell Morgan, but C. Powell Morgan also had a lot of collaborators too in the work that he was doing. And there was a lot of money being funneled through Commodore Acceptance and Commodore. Tramiel and Cap were partners in some of these dummy corporations that were being used to move loans around, and they were definitely making some profit on the shuttling around of those loans. Yeah, Commodore Acceptance being the factoring company. Commodore Sales Acceptance. I did leave out the word sales. Commodore Sales Acceptance. Could they have really been making all of that profit and being part of all of these little dummy corporations and not realizing that it was at the very least unethical, if not illegal? Hard to say that as well. But were they also so sophisticated that they could do this without leaving any evidence of their wrongdoing? I'm not sure Jack Tramiel was that much of a mastermind at that point in his life. So, it could go either way. But, we do have to say, for, legal reasons, that both Tramiel and Cap were exonerated by the Royal Commission and faced no charges for their activities in this time. There's just one tiny little problem, though, for Commodore business machines. At the time, they were in the process of vertically integrating by trying to break into retail for office equipment. They were importing typewriters and adding machines. I think by this point they were also into office furniture. So they decided to buy a retail establishment, a retailer, by the name of Wilson's Stationers.
Stationers, as in stationery.
Yes. They were the largest stationery store in Canada, and they were also a general office supply company. They're not a big box store, but think Staples, think Office Max. They weren't huge centers like that, but, think general office supply store. So a perfect place to be selling adding machines and typewriters. Atlantic Acceptance was financing the deal to buy Wilson Stationers. That financing kind of went away on account of Atlantic Acceptance went away. They were able to salvage the deal, but they had to take out a loan at way above prime because most financiers and banks would not touch them because of the taint of Atlantic Acceptance. Yeah, Essa Oliva points out, which is a good point, that even Atlantic was trying to talk Jack out of this deal. Jack had this overriding idea throughout his time in business that everything would be so much better if he could just get into retail and sell his own products, because then he wouldn't have to deal with all of those people that keep wanting terms and contracts and then get mad when I decide to go off over here and offer my stuff at a lower price. And then for some reason don't want to do business with me anymore because I screwed them over on inventories. This was the first example of that. He did it again when he got in the calculator business and bought the Mr. Calculator stores for Commodore. Then he did it a third time at Atari Corporation when he bought Federated as an outlet for his Atari computers. Every time it was a bad idea and he should feel bad. It's basically what crushed Atari Corporation. Someday we'll do an Atari Corporation episode, and there were other underlying problems with where the company was going too, but the company was kind of doing okay until he decided to buy Federated. It wasn't a great idea, but he was too far along. He had to go through with it. He had to take a loan way above the prime rate in order to keep the deal going. And then, of course, it didn't end up being worth it at all. One source I have says that he took 11%. It was 11% on a 6-month loan. Yeah. $3 million loan payable in 6 months. And I believe it was at 11% interest at a time when the prime rate was 5%. So it was a terrible deal. At the time, they had a manufacturing plant in Germany because they had expanded out into some manufacturing by this point. That had to be put up as collateral. He needed some bridge financing right away so that he could get out of this entire mess. That is how he ended up connecting with a financier by the name of Irving Gould. Now we need to go back and talk a little bit about the background of the other person who was crucial to the history of Commodore. And it's not Manfred Kopp. Manfred Kopp remained a partner and secretary-treasurer of the company until 1968, and then he was gone from Commodore history after 1968. The other important figure in the entire history of the company, whose influence would last long after Jack was gone, is one Mr. Irving Gould. So now we need to do another backstory, but thankfully this one is not nearly so tragic. We've already filled our quota for depressing backstories. I can't say that I know everything about Mr. Gould, but I did a lot of research, and I was able to connect some of the dots here. Irving Gould, also Jewish, was the son of an individual by the name of Joseph Gould. Joseph Gould was born in New York, but came to Toronto as a child and was an entrepreneur from an early age, selling newspapers on downtown street corners. He ended up in the clothing business, which the garment trade was a common trade for people of Jewish descent to get into in those days. Served as a representative, as a salesman for various companies in Western Ontario, until he was finally able to establish his own factory in 1926 to enter the clothing manufacturing business. At some point, I don't know exactly when, this company morphed into Joseph Gould and Sons, which became a manufacturer primarily of sportswear and rainwear. On around 1946, maybe a little bit before that, his sons, the sons mentioned, joined the business. He had 3 sons, though in this case were most interested in the eldest, Albert, and the middle son, Irving, who joined the business. Albert Gould as general manager, Irving Gould as sales manager. I believe Irving Gould studied law. Ethan, you looked a little bit into his education. Quick, in real time, give me some education information on Irving Gould. Ethan Johnson is a friend of the show, and sometimes you have to earn that friendship.
That's right. We put you to work doing real research in real time on a real live stream.
Yes, so he was educated in law. I don't know much more than that. I do think that he was also in the Royal Canadian Air Force in World War II, but I don't know much about that either. But the important thing is, after the war, he was installed as the sales manager at Joseph Gould and Sons, makers of fine sportswear and rainwear. I think one of the Commodore people mentioned that he'd been in the Royal Canadian Air Force, but this is the same guy who thought that his father made his fortune in shipping, so he could also be completely incorrect about that. I wasn't just going off of the newspapers, but that is a fair point. There are other Irving Goulds out there in the world as well. I have a lot of the stops along the way. I don't know exactly what moved him through every stop, but we've got a lot of stops along the way. At some point, Albert and Joseph expand. I think they remain at Joseph Gould and Sons, at least for a while, but they expand out into their own businesses as well. And in 1950, they took over a company known as Acme Glove Works. So got into the glove making business as well. That lasted until 1954, when Albert Gould, who was leading that venture, Irving Gould was serving as Secretary-Treasurer, I believe, was forced out of the company due to them piling up a large amount of debt. Somewhere at that point, then, the brothers decided to get into the mining promotion business. I think Canada was undergoing a bit of a mining boom at the time. Our resident Canadian can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm sure he knows all about 1950s Canadian mining ventures. But I do believe there was something of a mining boom going on at the time in Canada. So they became mining promoters. What a mining promoter does is they finance new mining operations. They sell shares to the public to raise capital to start up a new mine. So they're getting into the financing business. I think the clothing business that Joseph Gould had was fairly successful. I think that the family had a decent amount of money, and Joseph Gould actually passed away in 1947. So I think there was family trust money. I mean, Joseph Gould and Sons continued for a little bit after that, but I think there was also family trust money. So I think they were starting to use the family money to get involved in investing. So they became mining promoters. They each had their own companies. Irving Gould purchased a company called Klondike Keno Mines that had a group of mineral claims, and renamed it J Explorations Limited, Jayej. His daughter was named Jay, so I'm assuming that he named the venture after his daughter, but I don't know that for certain, after he purchased the company in 1955. So the glove company fails in 1954, and then he's right back in business in the mining exploration, mining promoting business. Yes, we have confirmed that Irving Gould was in the RCAF, the Royal Canadian Air Force. He did that business until 1959, when he left J Explorations, resigned as president and left the company. Not long after that, he had a little where he actually lied on behalf of his brother Albert about some money that was being moved around, and he got kind of a slap on the wrist while his brother was being investigated, but nothing serious came of it. He was charged, but they didn't do much to him. So presumably he continued to amass more money in the mining business, because that's a lucrative business if you do it right, and he decided to move on from there to becoming a financier of small industrial companies, through a company that he originally called JPIN Holdings and later named, unless it's a different company, I don't know, I don't care, the Diversified Credit Corporation. It was using Gould family trust money and probably some of his own money to help finance small industrial companies that needed to raise capital but weren't big enough to actually get on the stock market. And so they would do over-the-counter offerings that were financed by Gould's company. He did this for a series of companies. May not have been the first one, but the first one that I have mention of is one called Clairtone Sound. Then he had a real bonanza with a company called Stedman Industries. This is an episode about computers, right, Jeffrey? We're going to talk about computers, right?
I believe so, yes. But the amount of shell companies related to Commodore is mind-boggling. I feel I need to get some push pins, some colored yarn, pictures, and do a whole conspiracy thing with this because I'm having trouble following it.
Indeed. But he had a big bonanza, not in video games, with a company called Stedman Industries, which was involved in the shipping business. They were actually one of the first companies to pioneer a container shipping system where you could put a container off of a boat onto a truck and then put that exact same container from the truck onto a railroad car, thus allowing for smaller ports that previously could not do a lot of shipping trade to be able to be involved in that trade. It was truly revolutionary if one cares about the shipping industry, which I do not. But truly revolutionary, Stedman Industries. He was the chairman of that company, and I believe made a lot of money there. As I kind of alluded to earlier, one of the Commodore people that got to know Gould a little bit, because he worked in New York where Gould had his American office, said in that book that his father had made his money in the shipping business. Well, he didn't. His father made his money in the clothing business. He was probably conflating Stedman Industries, and it seems like that was a huge source of his money because that company was very, very successful. They eventually, to avoid paying Canadian taxes, created a new parent company called Interpool that was founded in the tax shelter of the Bahamas, something that would become very common for Mr. Gould to do in the future. So he had Stedman Industries, where he was the chairman. In 1961, he financed a company called Super Pack Vending, which was a vending company, but it was a very, very specific type of vending, which was laundry products, soap, bleach, and plastic bags dispensed by machine for automatic laundries.
Laundry.
Yes, literally laundering money. Should have invested in laser tag. I hear that's the best place to launder money. Bonus points if you get that reference. So he's doing all of these deals for these various kinds of things. This is what he does. And so Commodore is right up his alley. And so at some point in here, as Jack Tramiel is looking for a bridge loan to make it through the day, as he's paying a ridiculous amount of money for this Wilson Stationers nonsense, he ends up getting in with Irving Gould. Irving Gould, or one of his companies, ends up brokering a sale of Wilson Stationers to an Idaho-based company and gets Tramiel out of the mess. Commodore loses money, but things are better. He did actually, though, go in debt. Oh, it was J-Penn Holdings. Perfect. Which, as we mentioned earlier, thank you, SM Oliva. SM Oliva's done even more research on this than I have. So yeah, he made the deal with J-Penn Holdings, which was, as we talked about earlier, Irving Gould's financing company. Reports. Who reads those? I just have somebody draw me a little picture. Yes, SM Oliva is the real Department of Corrections. Yeah, so J-Penn Holdings was the financing company at the time, which I think later changed its name to Diversified Credit, or was supplanted by Diversified Credit. One or the other, who knows? Something Bahamas. But that did put Jack into debt to J-Penn. Okay, J-Penn sold Wilson to Boise Cascade, that's the Idaho company I was referring to, and then kept the surplus as a commission. There was also an outstanding debt that in November 1965 still amounted to $300,000. Ooh, yes, I should have read SM Oliva's blog. All of you should go read SM Oliva's blog, but I definitely should have done so.
Bad Alex, no cookie.
So this is a direct quote. This is a direct quote from SM Oliva's blog, Computer Chronicles Revisited. Please go look. Gould found a buyer for Wilson Stationers in November 1965, selling the company to U.S.-based Boise Cascade for $3,345,444. Traders got its $3 million, that being the company that he borrowed the money from initially at the ridiculous interest rate. Amber Holdings and Gould got a $340,000 commission. Tramiel and Cap received $20,000 in exchange for surrendering their stock options. The only losers were Commodore shareholders, as the company ended up losing about $600,000 on the entire Wilson Stationers adventure after factoring in the additional costs of the sale. Yes, Amber was another Gould holding company, and as a result of all of this, Gould ended up, in lieu of being paid back his $300,000, Gould invested $500,000 in Commodore to get 18% of the stock and become chairman of the board and the largest individual shareholder of the company, meaning that he had basically complete control. So where does that leave Commodore? Well, they're in adding machines, they're in typewriters, they're in office furniture, they're in office equipment. They're in really kind of dire straits financially because of all that has gone on. They were near bankruptcy. They were now controlled by Mr. Irving Gould, who controlled 17.9%, rounds up to 18% of the company. It was hard to figure where to turn next, and it was actually Irving Gould who gave them the way forward, because he wasn't just an investor. He took an active role, for better or for worse at times. But one of the things he did in the beginning here, in addition to reducing debt and selling off manufacturing facilities, is he pointed Jack in the direction of Japan. Pointed him to the wonders of taking designs to Japan and having them manufactured really cheap. It was while doing business in Japan on his existing product line that Tramiel was exposed to some of the earliest electronic calculators. That led him down the path of doing the same thing that everyone else would start doing very soon after that, which is finding a Japanese company that has a great, well-crafted, cheap electronic product and have them do OEM manufacturing for you so you can slap your own brand on it and sell it for great profit. Commodore introduced its first calculator from Casio in 1968, the same year that Jack decided to move his operation from Canada to Palo Alto, in the heart of what would soon become Silicon Valley, because it was a more convenient place to be located to accept stock coming from the East. His profits started growing rapidly, especially after 1971, when they released one of the earliest pocket calculators. His profits steadily rose from $130,000 in 1968 to $700,000 in 1970 to $1.3 million in 1973. He opened new factories to keep up with demand in Virginia and England, as well as in California. Then in 1974, he ran headlong into the calamity of the calculator wars.
Was it like the computer wars, except worse?
Oh, we talked about the calculator wars when we talked about the home computer wars. And yes, they were like those, except worse, where calculators that were selling for hundreds of dollars in 1971 were selling for as low as $9.95 in 1975. Partially driven, of course, by improving technology and economies of scale, and also driven by Texas Instruments deciding to take advantage of their vertical integration and scared of what the Japanese might do once they had learned all they needed to learn from TI chips and started making their own chips, decided to enter the market themselves and could undercut the competition because of their vertical integration. This was a disaster for Commodore. By 1975, the company was reporting multi-million-dollar losses and was on the verge of bankruptcy. So once again, Jack Tramiel has been pushed to the brink of disaster less than a decade later, or about a decade on, really, from Atlanta acceptance, and has to do everything he can to survive. He closed his plant in England. He moved his Japanese subsidiary. They had founded a Japanese subsidiary in 1971 in Osaka. It was primarily there to source cheap parts rather than to sell into the Japanese market, which was fairly closed. But Osaka was not actually all that close to the suppliers, so he moved the company to Tokyo. He basically recreated a new Commodore Japan. He started really cutting down on terms and only selling his merchandise to high-volume buyers who would pay pretty much immediately. On the advice of his friend Irving Gould, they moved the company in 1976 out of Canada, where it was still technically incorporated, even though Jack himself by this time had moved to California. And Commodore Business Machines Limited of Canada was replaced by Commodore International, a Bahamian company with executive headquarters in Silicon Valley, worldwide offices in Britain, Germany, Switzerland, which represented the rest of Commodore Europe, and Japan. Under this new structure, Commodore International was basically a holding company, with Irving Gould as the chairman and Jack Tramiel as the CEO. Then all of these subsidiaries around the world had managing directors who were fairly independent of each other. Now, Jack was based in the United States, while Commodore USA, or Commodore Business Machines, which is what it was really called, technically had presidents all through this period. Jack basically ran the show there. But the general managers in places like Germany, Switzerland, England, and Japan, who weren't right under Jack's thumb, actually had a lot of leeway to do their own things. Yeah, this allowed them to avoid some taxes, is basically what it did, which was another thing that helped the company cut costs. The final thing that he decided he had to do was vertically integrate, because he never wanted to be in a situation again where he was at the mercy of the markets for buying his components and was at the mercy of companies that had their own vertical integration like Texas Instruments, who could undercut him on price because they had their own components. This led him into the market for a semiconductor company. He alighted on one of the largest independent semiconductor manufacturers that was still standing, if only barely, at the end of the calculator wars by the name of MOS Technologies. At this point, Commodore had a major cash flow problem. It was bad. They couldn't really afford to buy this company with the money that he had on hand. Yes, Commodore was a major cash flow problem, for real, SM Oliva. They actually had to do a little bit of shenanigans to get the cash over from the United Kingdom, because Commodore actually had a much better reputation in Germany and the United Kingdom at this time. There were some very competent general managers over there that had built up a strong brand image for Commodore. And so Commodore calculators were considered like top of the line stuff. So they were doing a pretty good business over there. By this time, of course, Commodore was also in the digital watch business, because it was the mid-1970s and everyone thought that that was a pretty neat idea. That business was not doing so great either, and Commodore was feeling some ill effects from that as well. But what he did is he told his marketing guy in Britain, one Mr. Kit Spencer, that he needed some cash so that he could buy this chip company, MOS Technology. But the problem is he couldn't just send cash over, because Commodore was on the verge of bankruptcy. It was looking like receivers might be called in any day, and if the company did go bankrupt and it came to light that right as the receivers were knocking on the door, Kit Spencer had just wired a bunch of money to America, that could actually be a felony. It's not so easy to just move money around international subsidiaries, especially when you're going bankrupt. So what Spencer did is he got the high street retailer Boots to take 25,000 digital watches that the company didn't really want. But he was open with them and told them that they were buying a chip company and convinced them this was a good idea. They were like, "Why do you want us to take these watches? Are you going bankrupt?" It's like, yes, we are. He didn't say that part out loud, but it's like, yes, we are, but that's not what this is about. Really, we're buying a chip company. So they took the watches. Then he factored the inventory, because Boots is taking the watches on terms. They're not paying right away. Factored the inventory so they had the cash right away. As I said, factoring is like a payday loan for businesses. And then went to Jack and was like, I have your money. Just give me whatever random, crappy, terrible inventory you have lying around, and I will pay for that inventory with this money, and then you will have your money to buy a chip company. So that's what they did. The inventory that he received from Jack, he went and sold at a loss in the United Kingdom. And according to Kit, Jack came to him later and was like, why did you sell all this crap and lose money on it? Kit was like, remember that time when you really needed some money? Yes. It's like, that's how I got you the money. And then he was like, oh, fine. Then let's never mention that again. I don't think those were his exact words, but he was a little more understanding at that point.
I would imagine so, yes.
Jack Tramiel got his chip company, and little did he realize that in the process, he was also buying himself a computer company. So in our next episode, we will finally get to the computer business of it all, as we talk about MOS Technology, the Kim 1, the Commodore PET, and all the computer shenanigans that would follow over the next few years at Commodore International.
Really a lot of corporate shenanigans, more so than we typically get in an episode, and it is crazy to see how you go from really bare bones, destitute, horrible childhood and initial upbringing into corporate shenanigans, borderline money laundering, shell companies, insanity of business that is just astonishing.
Absolutely. This will be 3 parts that we live stream. It is very possible that someday in the future we will have to do the Fall of Commodore as a 4th part, because I'm definitely seeing a world where we do the 8-bits in the next one, and then the early days of the Amiga and the one after that. But we are not sitting here for 4 episodes, even if it turns into 4 episodes. Let's put it that way.
Aww. Come on. I've got this wonderful background and everything. We can do 4 episodes. You got caffeine. I can get caffeine.
I've done more research on the first 3 parts, so if it goes to 4 parts, it'll be safer for everybody to do the 4th part later.
Okay, so we all know what we need to do. SM Oliva, summarize the 4th part for us and provide that to Alex while we record the next 2 episodes. So we now know what we all have to do for this thing to go on.
Mediali's bad. PCs get to the point where cheap, low-market Commodore PC clones don't work out anymore. The Amiga completely falls behind the PC graphically because it can't do chunky graphics. And the company goes bankrupt. There you go. There's your part 4. You got your part 4 even before part 2 and part 3. You happy now?
It's the teaser for the end, right? Teaser for the end.
Indeed. So, yeah, no, we will. I fully concede the Commodore may take 4 episodes, but I don't know that we'll do 4 episodes sitting here. In all seriousness. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. Maybe we will. That's what'll keep them all hanging on to the end. Will they or won't they? I hear that's the tension that keeps all the shows on the air.
It is.
If it worked for moonlighting, it can work for They Create Worlds, damn it.
That's right. Well, I don't know about you kids, but this editing that I'm going to have to do for this episode is already going to be insane enough. So I'm going to call it quits here. We'll see you next time on They Create Worlds, or in about 15 minutes. You get to decide. Bye-bye. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have links to some of the things that we discussed in this and other episode. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shape the video game industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Feel free to email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworlds. If you do sign up, please do so through the website and not through the iOS app. This saves you from the 30% Apple markup. We understand that you may not be able to financially support us, but you can still support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting service that you use. We now have the podcast available on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Roll Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. if you want to see the live stream in its entirety, that is available on YouTube, or will be on YouTube shortly, depending on how I get everything set up. Live the insanity. Enjoy it all.